The message was 23 seconds long. I played it 47 times before the sun came up, sitting in the dark kitchen of my house in Flagstaff, Arizona, with a cold cup of coffee going untouched beside me and my hands shaking so badly I kept dropping the phone. My name is Gerald Holt. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching middle school English in the Flagstaff Unified School District, retired 4 years ago, and now spend most of my time reading, tending a garden that my late wife would have found embarrassing, and waiting for a phone that almost never rings. 3 years ago, I had a son, a daughter-in-law, and a grandson who used to fall asleep in my arms watching baseball. Now I have an empty guest bedroom, a drawer full of drawings I can't bear to look at, and a 23-second audio message that is going to bring everything to the surface. Let me start from the beginning. Because the beginning matters. My son, who I will call by the nickname I gave him when he was born, Bud, was 29 years old when he married a woman named Tressa. I did not dislike Tressa at first. She was sharp, organized, the kind of person who had a plan for everything. What I mistook for confidence turned out, over time, to be something harder and colder than that. But in the early years, I kept my doubts to myself, because Bud loved her, and because 3 years into their marriage, they had a son. My grandson was born in January, 7 pounds 4 ounces, the most perfect thing I had ever seen. He did not cry right away. He looked around the room with these serious gray eyes, like he was taking inventory. The nurses laughed. I stood in the corner and tried not to make a fool of myself crying. I failed. By the time my grandson was 2.5, it was clear that he was developing differently than other children his age. He did not speak. He struggled with transitions, with certain sounds, with being touched by people he did not know. The pediatric specialists eventually landed on a diagnosis of nonverbal autism, level 2. I remember sitting with Bud in the hospital parking lot after that appointment. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, how do we help him? Not how do we fix him? How do we help him?" That was my son. Tressa heard the diagnosis differently. I could see it in her face during that appointment, the way something closed off behind her eyes. She started using phrases like burden of care and long-term placement and quality of life in ways that made my stomach turn. Bud pushed back. He threw himself into learning about AAC, augmentative and alternative communication, the devices and systems that allow nonverbal people to communicate using pictures, symbols, and synthesized speech. He ordered a tablet-based communication device and spent every evening teaching my grandson to use it. My grandson was brilliant at it. Within months, he was pointing to symbols and constructing simple requests. Within a year, he was stringing sentences together on the device with a fluency that stunned his speech therapist. He had things to say. He had always had things to say. He had just been waiting for someone to hand him the right tools. Then Bud died. He was driving home from a parent-teacher conference on a Tuesday night in November. A driver running a red light hit his car on the passenger side. Bud died at the scene. He was 34 years old. I do not have words for that night or for the weeks that followed. I don't think I ever will. Bud had a life insurance policy worth $400,000. Per the terms he had set up 3 years before his death, the bulk of it went into a trust for my grandson, to be administered until my grandson turned 25. Tressa was named trustee. The remaining amount went directly to Tressa. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly the kind of careful planning my son had done because he was the kind of man who thought about what would happen to the people he loved after he was gone. I did not know then what I know now about what Tressa chose to do with that trust. In the months after Bud's death, I stayed close. I came over twice a week, took my grandson to the park, sat on the floor with him and his communication device, learned the symbol layout so I could talk with him the way his father had. My grandson and I had a language together. It was clumsy and slow, but it was ours. He would tap his device and it would say, "I want outside," and I would take him to the backyard, and we would sit in the grass while he lined up pine cones in patterns only he understood. Those afternoons were the only hours during that period where I felt like I could breathe. About 8 months after Bud died, Tressa began pulling back on my access. First, the twice-weekly visits became once a week, then once every 2 weeks. She started citing my grandson's schedule, his therapies, his need for consistency. I accommodated every excuse because I was terrified of making things worse, terrified of losing what little connection I had left. Then a man named Dale started appearing in the background. I noticed him first at a birthday party Tressa hosted, standing in the kitchen with a familiarity that suggested he had been there many times before. He was younger than Tressa, late 30s, with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tressa introduced him as a friend. The way she said it made clear that questions were not welcome. 6 months later, Dale had moved in. 6 months after that, my visits had been reduced to 1 Sunday per month, supervised, 2 hours maximum. I hired a family lawyer. She told me that as a grandparent in Arizona, my legal standing for visitation was limited but not impossible. She filed a petition. Tressa's lawyer responded swiftly, aggressively, and expensively, arguing that my presence caused disruption to my grandson's routines and that Tressa, as his sole surviving parent, had the right to determine what was best for him. The family court judge, looking at my fixed retirement income and Tressa's attorney's polished arguments, granted Tressa's request to limit my visits further. Monthly visits were reduced to holiday only, supervised at a neutral location, with 48 hours advance notice required for any contact. My last visit was on Easter Sunday, 14 months ago. My grandson sat across from me at a table in a family services office, his communication device on the table between us. A supervisor sat in the corner pretending to read. Tressa waited in the lobby. Dale was not there, which was the only mercy. My grandson and I talked about pine cones. I told him I was still growing tomatoes in the garden and that he could come pick them any time. He tapped his device slowly. The synthesized voice said, "I miss Grandpa." I told him I missed him too. When the 2 hours were up, the supervisor stood and I stood, and my grandson looked at me with those serious gray eyes that were identical to his father's, and he tapped the device one more time. It said, "Don't forget me." I told him that was not possible, not ever. Then the supervisor gently guided him toward the lobby, and that was the last time I saw him in person. For 14 months, I heard nothing. No updates, no photos, no responses to the certified letters my lawyer sent requesting information about my grandson's educational and therapeutic progress, which I was legally entitled to receive. My lawyer filed motions. Tressa's lawyer responded with delays. The courts moved at their own pace while my grandson was somewhere in a house with a man named Dale, and I had no way of knowing if he was okay. 52 days ago, at 11:18 at night, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I almost didn't answer. I thought it was a spam call, a robocall, the kind of thing that comes through at odd hours pretending to be important. There was no voice on the other end, just a sound I recognized immediately. The flat, synthesized tones of an AAC device reading out a pre-recorded message. 23 seconds. A child's finger tapping symbols on a tablet, symbols that formed sentences, sentences that the device spoke aloud into the phone in that same mechanical voice I had spent years learning to love. "Grandpa, I need help. Bad man hurts me when Mommy goes to work. I saw papers about Daddy's money. They are taking it. Dale knows a lawyer. I am scared. Please come." 23 seconds. I played it 47 times before sunrise, listening to every syllable, reading every word from memory, trying to understand how a 9-year-old nonverbal child had gotten access to a phone, had known my number, had figured out how to call and play a pre-recorded message from his device. Later, I would find out that he had memorized my number from an old birthday card I had sent him that he kept hidden under his mattress, that he had used Dale's phone while Dale was in the shower, that he had practiced tapping out the message on his device for 2 weeks, rehearsing it privately before he made the call. My grandson was 9 years old and he had been preparing this for 2 weeks. I did not sleep that night. By 6 in the morning, I had made a list of everyone I needed to call. The first call I made was to my lawyer. The second was to Northern Arizona University's Department of Communication, Sciences, and Disorders. Dr. Patricia Wen called me back within the hour. She was the director of the AAC clinic at NAU, had been working with nonverbal children for over 25 years, had published research on AAC language development and forensic applications. She was professional, precise, and she listened without interrupting while I explained everything. "Can I hear the message?" she asked. I played it over the phone. There was silence on her end when it finished. "How old is your grandson?" 9. He was diagnosed at 2.5. Nonverbal autism, level 2. His father started him on AAC when he was 3. Bud was the one who worked with him on it. He died 3 years ago. Another silence. "Mr. Holt? The message construction I just heard is not typical for a 9-year-old AAC user at any level. The syntax, the sequencing of ideas, the way he has organized cause and effect in a limited number of symbol combinations. That represents a high degree of communicative sophistication. Is that unusual? For a child who has had limited access to consistent AAC instruction for the past 3 years, yes. It's remarkable, actually." She paused. "I would like to see this in person. Could you bring me the audio file? And if possible, any previous recordings of your grandson using his device?" I drove to Flagstaff in 20 minutes. Dr. Wen met me in her office, a room filled with tablets and communication boards and printed research papers in stacks that looked precarious but probably had their own logic. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a lanyard and the focused energy of someone who had spent decades paying close attention to things other people overlooked. She listened to the audio 3 times. She asked me questions about my grandson's developmental history, his device model, his symbol library, his instruction history. She took notes. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. The person she called was a colleague from the psychology department, Dr. Marcus Teller, who specialized in child trauma and forensic interviewing. He arrived 20 minutes later, listened to the audio twice, and sat back in his chair with an expression I did not know how to read. He looked at Dr. Wen. "The part about the papers," he said. "The money. The lawyer." "I know," she said. He turned to me. "Mr. Holt, I want to be clear about what I am about to say. Your grandson's message contains specific claims about financial misconduct and physical abuse. Those are serious allegations. Before we go any further, I have to ask you directly. Is there any reason you can think of why someone might have coached him to say this?" I thought about it honestly. I thought about Tressa's family, her friends, whether anyone in my grandson's life might want to manufacture a crisis for some strategic purpose. "No," I said. "He has no relationship with anyone on my side of the family except me. Tressa controls all his contacts. He barely leaves the house as far as I know. If anyone coached him, it would have had to be someone in that house." Dr. Teller looked at Dr. Wen again. "The financial language?" she said quietly. "A 9-year-old nonverbal child does not have the concept of a trust fund and a lawyer and money being taken unless he has been exposed to those conversations." He heard it, and he remembered it. She looked at me. "Your grandson is not supposed to be able to understand those conversations, Mr. Holt. He is 9 years old and nonverbal. The people in that house almost certainly speak freely in front of him because they believe he cannot comprehend what they are saying." The words landed on me like cold water. They talked in front of him the same way they always had. Like he wasn't really there. Like understanding was something that only happened out loud. Dr. Teller was already reaching for his phone. The Flagstaff Police Department was professional and thorough. Detective Rosa Ibarra, a woman in her 40s with a direct manner and no patience for unnecessary words, took my statement and the audio file and spent 2 days making calls before she came back to me. "Mr. Holt," she said, sitting across from me in a conference room at the station. "I have confirmed a few things. Your daughter-in-law is the trustee for a $400,000 trust established for your grandson. A trust of that size, for a minor with a disability, is subject to annual accounting requirements with the probate court. Those accountings were due in October of last year and did not arrive. The court sent a notice. That notice was also ignored. What does that mean? It means that there is already an open inquiry at the probate court level into the administration of your grandson's trust. Your grandson's message may have just given us the reason why that accounting never came." She paused. "There is also a man named Dale Frick living in the residence. I ran his background. He has 2 prior convictions for fraud-related offenses in Nevada and a sealed juvenile record. He currently lists his occupation as a financial consultant." She said the phrase without inflection, but I heard what she meant by it. I asked her about the abuse my grandson had described. "That requires a different process," she said. "We will need to involve CPS and a forensic interviewer who specializes in working with nonverbal children. Dr. Teller at NAU has already reached out to our department. We're going to move carefully because we need to move correctly. If there is abuse happening in that house, we will find it. But I need you to let us do this the right way." I told her I understood. I told her I would wait. Waiting was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have buried a son. 19 days after Detective Ibarra's call, she contacted me again. She told me that a forensic review of the trust accounts, conducted by a court-appointed financial examiner, had found significant irregularities. Over $260,000 had been dispersed from the trust over a 32-month period through a series of transactions that did not qualify as legitimate expenses under the trust's terms. The disbursements had been funneled through an LLC registered in Nevada to a shell account connected to Dale Frick. Tressa, as trustee, had authorized every transaction. They had been stealing my grandson's inheritance. The money Bud had set aside to give his son a future. They had been taking it in pieces, quietly, for nearly 3 years, counting on the fact that a nonverbal 9-year-old could not walk into a courtroom and tell anyone what he had overheard. They had miscalculated. CPS conducted a home assessment the same week as the financial examination. My grandson was interviewed using his AAC device with Dr. Teller present as a specialist. I was not in the room. I had to sit in a waiting area down the hall for 4 hours, drinking bad coffee and reading the same paragraph of a magazine 20 times without absorbing a word. When Dr. Teller came out, his face told me what I needed to know before he opened his mouth. He disclosed, he said quietly, consistently, and specifically. Dale had been hitting him, primarily on the upper arms and back where clothing would hide the marks. He had been told repeatedly that no one would believe him because he couldn't talk. He had been called a burden more times than he could count on his device. He had been told that his father had not wanted him, that the only reason Tressa kept him was out of obligation. My grandson had been living with that. For nearly 3 years, he had been living with that, and he had still managed to find a way to reach out. He had still managed to keep hope alive that someone, somewhere, would come if he asked. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning. I was not there for them, but Detective Ibarra called me as it was happening. Tressa was taken into custody at the house. Dale Frick was arrested at a coffee shop 2 miles away, where he was apparently having a leisurely breakfast. He did not resist. Neither did Tressa, though the detective told me she spent the ride to the station insisting that everything was a misunderstanding and that her son had not understood what he was saying. Her son had understood everything. My grandson went to a temporary foster placement that morning, a family that had been briefed on his needs and had an AAC-compatible setup in their home. Detective Ibarra told me this directly, and told me that given the circumstances, the court would be reviewing my petition for emergency guardianship at a hearing the following Monday. I spent that weekend preparing more carefully than I have prepared for anything in my life. My lawyer worked through both days. I gathered everything. The 31 years of teaching records, the character letters from former colleagues and neighbors, the documentation of every visit I had ever made, every letter I had sent, every motion I had filed, trying to stay in my grandson's life. I gathered photographs of us together. I found a video Bud had sent me 3 years before he died, of my grandson and me sitting in the backyard, my grandson lining up his pine cones while I narrated each one like a baseball announcer, and my grandson's shoulders shaking with silent laughter. At the Monday hearing, the judge reviewed the financial fraud case, the CPS findings, and the guardianship petition. The guardian ad litem appointed for my grandson had spoken with him the previous Friday using his device. I was told, but not present for, what my grandson had communicated when asked where he wanted to live. He had tapped 3 symbols. With Grandpa. The judge granted the emergency guardianship that afternoon. I drove to pick him up the following morning. The foster family had done everything right. They met me at the door with him standing just behind them, wearing a blue jacket I did not recognize, his communication device in his hands. He looked taller than I remembered. His gray eyes found me immediately. I did not run. I walked, because he does better with deliberate movement, with predictability. I crouched down in front of him so we were at the same height, and I opened my hands toward him, the way we used to do. He looked at his device, tapped slowly. The voice said, "You came." I told him I would always come, that there was no version of events in which I would not come. He thought about that for a moment. Then he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against my shoulder, the particular way he had always done since he was small, his specific way of saying what the device could not quite capture. I put my arm around him and did not move until he was ready. We drove home to Flagstaff in the afternoon light. He sat in the back seat with his device on his lap, occasionally tapping symbols just to hear the voice, the way some people hum to themselves on long drives. When we pulled into the driveway, he looked at the house for a long moment, tapped the device. Tomatoes? I had to laugh. I told him they were in the backyard. Not ready yet, but he could check on them. He was out of the car before I finished the sentence. The legal process that followed took most of the next year. Dale Frick was charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit breach of fiduciary duty, and multiple counts of child abuse. He took a plea agreement rather than face trial. 12 years in federal prison for the financial crimes. An additional 6 years to be served consecutively for the abuse charges. When his sentencing was read aloud in the courtroom, I sat 2 rows behind the prosecutor, and I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. Only the particular emptiness that comes when you have been waiting for something and it finally arrives and you realize it does not give back what was taken. Tressa faced the financial charges in a separate proceeding. Her lawyer argued that Dale had manipulated her, that she had been in a controlling relationship, that she had not fully understood the implications of the transactions she authorized. Some of it may have even been partially true. I do not know what went on inside that house. What I know is that her son had been hurt and she had not protected him. The jury convicted her on 4 counts of breach of fiduciary duty and financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. She received 8 years. She will likely serve 5 with good behavior. I did not watch her face when the verdict was read. I did not feel the need. Permanent guardianship was finalized 7 months after the emergency order. My grandson came home to Flagstaff with a bedroom that took us 3 weekends to decorate properly because he has very specific opinions about where things should go, and the opinions changed every time I thought we were finished. His room has 17 pine cones arranged on the windowsill in an order that he considers important. I have learned not to move them. He enrolled in a specialized program at the elementary school 3 blocks away, a program with a full-time AAC specialist and staff who had been trained in autism-affirming practices. Within 4 months, his communication vocabulary had expanded by over 250 symbols. His specialist told me she had never seen a child rebuild that fast. I told her she had never met Bud's son. We established routines. Breakfast at 7:30. Scrambled eggs on Tuesdays and Thursdays because those are his days. Oatmeal the rest of the week unless he taps otherwise. Walk to the park on weekend mornings when the weather permits. Tomatoes in the summer. Baseball on television Friday nights. Even though he doesn't watch the game so much as sit beside me and line up whatever small objects are nearest to him while the crowd noise fills the room, which his therapist says may be a form of auditory comfort. I have taken to providing small bowls of buttons specifically for this purpose. There are hard days. Days when he is overwhelmed and the device goes dark and the only communication available is the particular way he moves through the house, which I have learned to read the way you learn to read weather. Days when something will remind him of before and he will tap the same symbol over and over. No, no, no. And I will sit near him, not touching unless he reaches for me, and wait until it passes. There are also days like last Saturday, when he came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and stood at his device for almost 2 minutes, tapping something out very carefully, the way he does when the thought is complicated. The device said, "I want to teach you more symbols." I told him I would like that very much. He looked at me with those gray eyes. Then he tapped one more symbol, a simple one of the first symbols he had ever learned, one his father had taught him when he was 3 years old, sitting on the floor of a house that no longer exists with a tablet between them and a future neither of them fully knew was coming. The device said, "Thank you. I have thought about what it took for him to send me that message." 23 seconds of carefully rehearsed symbols, practiced alone in his room over 2 weeks. Tapped into a borrowed phone while the man who was hurting him took a shower 20 feet away. He was 9 years old. He did not know if I would answer. He did not know if anything would come of it. He reached out anyway, across every barrier that had been built to keep us apart, because somewhere in the 3 years of silence and control and being told he was not worth listening to, he had held on to the idea that I might be. I do not know what my son would think of all of this. I like to imagine he would not be surprised by his son. He would be proud. The deep, specific pride of a father who always believed in something that other people could not see yet. I still have the audio file saved on my phone. I play it sometimes, not in grief now, but in something closer to gratitude. 23 seconds of a 9-year-old boy tapping symbols in the dark, trusting that someone was still on the other end. He was right. Whatever road you are on right now, whatever silence has grown up between you and someone you love, do not assume they have forgotten you. Do not assume the quiet means nothing is being said. Sometimes the people who cannot speak out loud are the ones with the most to tell you. Sometimes all they need is to know you are still listening. Leave a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one, every time. If this reached you, hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds and it matters more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, real stories about ordinary people who refuse to let go of the people they love, subscribe to Friend Saga. New stories every week, hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Because sometimes 23 seconds is enough to bring someone home.